Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the 5 challenges within the global food supply chain. I'm joined today with Dr. Bob. He's our keynote speaker for today. So I'll just give a quick intro to Dr. Bob for those of you who are unfamiliar with him, and then we'll get started. Dr. Bob is one of our senior consultants with SI Global, with Assurance Services. He is one of the driving forces behind our food safety operations and operates in a number of different program areas, including GMP and a number of GFSI standards. He's a wealth of information with over 45 years experience in the food industry with all shapes and sizes of organizations, an avid trainer and speaker, and just a wealth of information. So with that, Dr. Bob, I will hand the presentation over to you and welcome today.
Good day to everybody. Thanks for tuning in again to one of our free webinars where we try to bring to you things that are topical. Hopefully at the end of this you will get some nuggets of information where you go, that can benefit me, because we are in the world where things are rapidly changing. Unfortunately, it's bringing things that are making it more complicated, particularly when we're in a global supply chain where you're either buying ingredients that are coming into your country from outside the country, or you're selling your product outside the country. We've chosen 5 things to talk about briefly in the next 45 minutes, and then as usual, we will take questions and answers. So please, if you got any questions, put them in the chat room and we will stop and answer the questions at the end. We're going to try to talk today about the importance of transparency, and there's nothing more important today on how well you handle the image that you have out there with your consuming public, with your customers, with the regulators, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the importance of traceability and how this becomes very important when you're having a problem. We're going to talk about food fraud, which is becoming a big global issue. And we'll talk about how big and the fact that regulators and GFSI are now requiring you to have food fraud programs. Food defense is not going away, and it's becoming much more critical that we defend the product at all stages against anybody who wants to deliberately contaminate an ingredient, a packaging material, or your finished product. And we're going to talk a little about the types of technology that are now available for you to be able to handle some of these challenges. So what is transparency? Well, transparency is obviously in the minds of your customers, the regulators, etc. How well are you going to be able to share information with them so they understand who they're buying from? They understand how well a job you're doing, whether it's quality, food safety, food defense, etc. And therefore, they're confident that you're doing a good job. And then when things go wrong, how willing are you to share with them information that can help them understand how you got into trouble with a regulator or how you got into a recall we'll talk about in a minute. Traceability. It's something obviously we talk a lot about. It's something that we have found that most of the GFSI audits have required us to have for years. But you don't understand how important it is until you need to find your product or find an ingredient you've used when you get a call from a supplier. So we're going to talk about that because this can be the deciding factor on how big is your problem going to be. Food fraud is not going away either. And in fact, according to the information that is available, it's getting bigger and bigger every year. When it was something was being done just for economic gain, and it was being done small scale, it's becoming large scale, it's becoming global. And we're going to talk about some examples of that and talk to you about how you're going to protect yourself about having a food fraud incident. Food defense, obviously in America, that goes back to 9/11, but it isn't just an American problem. This is an international problem. We're going to talk about some examples of where people are deliberately contaminating food to make a statement. And the statement is unfortunately going to cause injury or illness to the consumer who has nothing to do with the people who are causing the problems. So Holly's going to ask you to answer a questionnaire now on where you think currently your biggest challenges are.
That's great. Thanks, Dr. Bob. I'm going to launch the poll here, and we'll give you about 30 seconds to select your response. So what do you feel is the greatest challenge in the global food supply chain? Transparency, traceability, food fraud, food defense, or the use of technology. So I invite you to click on the screen and the response that's most appropriate in your view. And we'll share the results in just a moment. Dr. Bob, what do you expect folks will say?
I would think people are having a challenge with food fraud now, understanding what it really is. So therefore, how can I develop a program if I don't really know what it is or how it would affect me? I think the use of technology is another challenge for people today on what is available, where would it fit in with me, how can I convince management we should have it. I think the others, hopefully, these are things that are either with the C-level management or the things you've already got handle on.
Yeah, sounds reasonable. Let me close and share the results here. So the top response is food fraud, but transparency traceability is certainly close behind.
Right, obviously, I misguessed the use of technology, so and that means that you either know what technology is available or you don't know, and maybe that's the issue when only 10% of the people felt the use of technology was one of their challenges. So let's move on and let's talk in more detail about these different parts of these challenges. So what is transparency? Transparency is obviously in this world of everything getting on social media, everything getting blown out of proportion at times, trying to work out what fake news is versus real news. The question is, what does your customer think caused you to have the problem? How honest are you going to be or open with them? How are you going to minimize the damage to your business when you have a problem? And how credible are you going to be at the end of all that the customer wants to continue to buy your product after you've had a problem? Because if you don't get this across to the people who are buying your product, then you're going to have obviously a problem hanging on to your customer base. Grocery Manufacturers Association decided to do a survey on the consequence of recalls, which is obviously one of the things that causes you to have an image problem when you have a recall. And they went to a lot of the companies and they said to them, have you had a problem with a recall? And they said yes. 36 companies talked about it, and the impact was anything from $3 million to $100 million impact. And even $3 million is a lot of money for you to lose because you've had a recall. So you really can't afford to have a recall from a monetary point of view, but also from an image point of view. There was a fast food restaurant in the Boston area that finished up being closed by the U.S. Health Department. And that was because they finished up getting people sick. This came at a time when they'd already had problems with a couple of suppliers causing them to have problems that caused consumers to get sick. They were already trying to do damage control. Their stock value was going from high up in the high 800s down to in the 300s and has recovered slightly. But this is a financial disaster because the public lost confidence. They were the fastest growing fast food restaurant in America at the time this happened, and the competition was losing business to them, and that got reversed almost overnight. So what is total transparency? How well are you going to handle it? Some of those examples weren't handled real well, and the problem didn't go away. The problem got bigger. There's an example of a company who handled it real well. It goes back to 1993, so we are talking 25 years ago. But at that time, this company was getting complaints of syringes in cans of their diet soda. They decided to take it head on. They decided to go to the TV stations, to go to the press, and talk about how their product's made, how it's filled, how the cans are sealed, and how it's impossible for a syringe to get in a can. And they also went to the FDA and said, let's work together on this and make sure that we get across to people this has to be a hoax, which later it turned out to be, and people finished up getting prosecuted. But at the time, it caused a major, major recall, but they handled it right, and they minimized the damage to their reputation. Are you prepared to be able to handle a problem and minimize the concern of the customers and the consumers? If not, this could be a problem tomorrow that you could be facing. We talked about the impact of recalls. I could have picked many more examples than these three, but these three stand out because they had set examples of what happens when you have problems and you finish up with an image problem. The one talking about the 143,000 pounds of ground beef. When you take an animal to slaughter, an animal that is healthy can walk into the slaughterhouse and can walk up to being slaughtered. And that's considered an edible animal, and therefore it's basically something that can be slaughtered and then can finish up in the food supply. When the animal finishes up, he can't make it, he goes down and can't walk into the slaughterhouse, then normally the USDA in America comes over and examines the animal and declares the animal either fit or unfit for human consumption. This company decided to lift up these animals with a forklift and carry them to the slaughter box. The image problem was tremendous after that. It wasn't only a black eye for the government regulators, but it was also a black eye for the company that did this. We all know about the peanut butter, which resulted in 9 deaths. And they didn't make a retail peanut butter, so the impact was on their customers, who were the people who used the peanut butter, that resulted in 9 deaths, 500 people ill, and 5 people going to jail. A large ice cream manufacturer suddenly discovered that they had listeria in their product. Apparently, they had it a little longer than what was discovered in 2015, and it appears that the problem went back all the way to 2010. The only good news for them is they had a loyal customer base, they had a really good product, and they were able to survive, and they're still around today. But it did cause them a lot of money and a lot of bad publicity. So transparency is not only what are you willing to share, but what are you willing to share when you're having problems? How are you going to mitigate the risk? Who is the person who is your PR person? Who is the person who's going to go in front of the cameras? Who is the person who is going to try to get your consumers to buy your product again, get your customers to buy your ingredients again, and to keep you in business? Because as we've seen with some recalls costing $3 million to over $100 million, do you have deep enough pockets you could even survive financially? But when you do survive financially, how long does it take to build up your business? I could go back and talk about the spinach outbreak in 2006, and the fact that even today people are not eating as much spinach as they were prior to 2006, and here we are 12 years later. So now when you do have a problem, can you find the contaminated ingredient? Can you find your contaminated product? Does your traceability work, or is it just something on paper that you put there because a regulator says you have to have a traceability program, that you've got the GFSI auditor saying you've got a program, or will it really work? So what is traceability? It's obviously something that means you can find your product at any time. You can find the ingredients you've used at any time. The regulators now require it, and therefore you've got the regulators, no matter which country you're in, coming in and saying they want to be sure you got a traceability program, because when you have a problem, they want to get your product out of the marketplace real quickly. Your customers and consumers are demanding of that. It obviously also drives continuous improvement, because if your system works and you can find your product and you can find the ingredient quickly, then obviously you're not going to have a bigger incident than you would if you can't. And we'll talk in a minute about some companies who couldn't do that and finished up actually going out of business. And when you stay in business, do you lose credibility with your customers? Is this your biggest challenge right now, traceability? If it is, then you've got to get on top of it now, because if not, it could be a problem in the future that could cause you to lose customers or even close. So when we talk about that, we go back and you say, well, have you got an example of that? And our job is not here to name companies or to make out how people have lost control, other than to give you examples. This goes back actually 20 years ago, but this caused the company to go out of business. They had a problem with E. coli 15787, which is maybe somewhat of an incident now where we got a major corporation now having salmonella in a lot of ground beef. But this was E. coli. And when they finished up putting out the product and getting people sick, the government agency came back to them, having identified them as the source of the problem. And their first statement to the government was, don't worry about it. We've got it under control. We know the exact lot number. When the government said, what was the lot number? And they told them, they said that wasn't the problem product because our product wasn't even sent to the area where people are getting sick. So therefore, what they were trying to do is obviously tell the government that they had it under control, which they didn't. And when you don't have anything under control, the government then says, okay, we're going to take over how big your recall is going to be. They finished up pulling back 25 million pounds worth of product, involving 10 weeks worth of production. The plant closed, and it never reopened under the same management. They managed to sell the company off to somebody else, and obviously not for the value of the company. And they were back up in business again, but there was a period of time when they went. If they'd been able to do traceability, if they'd been able to identify the problem, if they were able to minimize the traceability, the chances are they would have still been around today under the same name, doing the same type of business. You've got to be able to minimize your risk with the regulators because they don't give you any sympathy at all when you can't say when the problem starts and you can't say when it ends. The government then forces you to pull back much more product than you would do if you could prove when it started and ended. Food fraud, something we wouldn't have talked about a few years ago, something we wouldn't have thought would be a problem a few years ago. But now the government is saying that it's about a $40 billion industry, where there are people out there who, for economic gain, are willing to risk the health and life of consumers by contaminated ingredients. In most cases, some of this isn't going to cause health issues. It's just economic gain fraud. But the problem is they're not that smart, some of the people doing food fraud, or they don't care. So some of the big examples we've had, and that's why we said this is not just a problem in certain countries, it's a problem throughout the world. The biggest examples were melamine, which caused a problem in Canada with a major pet food manufacturer who used melamine, which is a plasticizer, but they've been sold it as being like a gluten product. It seemed to work the same way, it seemed to do the same function, and then all of a sudden getting calls about cats and dogs dying. We've had people who took peanut shells, ground them up, and put them in cumin, maybe only 10 or 15%, so not accidental contamination, definitely food fraud. Just recently, in the last few years, we had a horse meat scandal with beef in the United Kingdom, and that not only had problems with the fact that it's legal to sell horse meat in England, but you don't sell it as beef. And you therefore compromise some people who wouldn't eat it because they wouldn't want to eat horse meat. And then we have catfish, which apparently is sold in lots of restaurants, unfortunately, throughout the world and misrepresented as being a much higher priced fish so that I can get more money for it. If we go back far enough, we can go back to 2003 when they were adding Sudan red dye to chili powder to make it look brighter, make it look fresher. And so we've had problems in the past, but they seem to be multiplying these days. So what is your program for food fraud? How vulnerable are you to food fraud? Could it happen to you? Because if it can, it will, unfortunately. This all ties in together because we've talked for years about food safety. And clearly you have to put out safe product. Since 9/11, in America, food defense became a big problem, but it's a big problem around the world. We've talked about the fact that your customer wants food quality. And we've talked about the fact that now you have to have food fraud. These all go together, and these are all your challenges. So unfortunately, life is getting more complicated to make sure that when you put out a product, it meets all of the requirements of a safe, good quality product, and it isn't being adulterated by somebody on purpose, either for economic gain, like food fraud, or just deliberately contaminated food defense. And people always ask the question, Are these all 4 separate programs? Yes, they are. Do I have to have programs to cover all these? Yes, you do. Well, I'm not getting certified to food quality. That doesn't matter. The customer still wants a quality product. So therefore, you do have food quality as part of what you're selling, even though you may not get being certified to a GFSI audit against quality. So let's talk a little bit more about food defense. One of the problems with food defense is, again, it's not just a regional thing. It is across the world. And we just had an example just recently, September of 2018. For some reason, somebody decided to put sewing needles in strawberries in Australia, which is rather traumatic when you bite into a strawberry and all of a sudden there's a needle sticking into your mouth or going down your throat. Now, who did it? I don't know. Why they did it? I don't know. Was somebody doing it as a lark? Was somebody doing it because they were mad at the strawberry grower? There was a statement being made in a strawberry pack house. Any more than what happened with the malathion added to frozen foods in Japan in 2014, which was a contract service employee working in a plant who decided to throw malathion into all the frozen foods, and he knew the company wasn't testing for that, and by the time they caught him, he had actually contaminated thousands and thousands and millions, I think it was, of pounds worth of product. And this was frozen product, and he'd done it for quite a period of time. We had an example in the United States, in Minnesota, where a person working in the plant, for some reason, decided to go out in the parking lot, pick up sand and dirt, bring it back, and throw it on the product. The thing about it is, in most cases, these people get caught. They don't think they're going to get caught. They don't apparently feel there's consequences to this. Maybe they're not thinking straight. But what is your food defense program? Because we have shown here in the United States, unfortunately, that one of the biggest threats is quite often the employee working in the plant. And I think in all of these cases, the sewing needles, it was most likely somebody internal who did it, not somebody walking into a supermarket or walking into somewhere off the street, sticking needles into the strawberries. So therefore, you say to yourself, food defense. Now we find out that government agencies want you to have it. We find out that GFSI wants you to have it. And now we're finding out that your current food defense program that maybe you've had for years isn't as good as it needs to be. And therefore, what you're being asked now is that you do a total vulnerability assessment of where in your operation, where in your supplier's operations, where on that truck coming to you or on that truck leaving you, is there a place where somebody who was of like mind and wanted to contaminate your product could do it? And then having identified those vulnerability assessments, what are you doing to try to make sure that that won't happen? And that's called a mitigation strategy. Therefore, in order to do this, you have to have training. So if you haven't had training in food defense, then here in America, the FDA is coming in to see those training records. And in the past, you said I didn't need to have food defense training records. Now you're going to have them come April of 2019. You've not only got to have your food defense plan then in writing, you've got to have it thought out, you've got to test it, and you've got to show you tested it, and you've got to do all this not only for GFSI, but you've also got to do it for a regulator. Do you have a detailed plan? Do you have it up to this level? Are you ready for April of 2019, or do you need help with this? Do you need to get somebody to come in and maybe consult with you, or put somebody to come in and do training, or go to a public class on food defense? I would suggest that you don't sit back and think your plan today is okay, and then find out in April of 2019 it isn't okay. So how are we going to use technology? One of the things that's available to you today is the fact that there are things available for you to help you with these challenges. Because we've just listed basically 4 different challenges, all which could affect your business. And one of them was transparency, which is not what would affect your business, but how well do you handle it? And if you don't handle it well, affect your business. But we talked about food defense, and we talked about food fraud, and we talked about protecting your product and your image. So whether you're going to go out on the internet and use things like artificial intelligence, advanced analytics, blockchain, there's many things on the internet. Are you going out and finding these? Are they something that you find beneficial? Let me talk a little about blockchain. Blockchain is intended, and there are other alternatives to blockchain, but the idea behind blockchain is that all along the chain from growing, raising the orchard, raising animals, etc., people are going to be adding information into a chain of the history of that ingredient, history of that product. And therefore, you will be able to lock in that information, and nobody further along in the chain can change it. But then at the next stage of the next step of the chain, somebody else can add information. And then in the next step, somebody else can add information. So what you're doing is you're building a history that can't be changed and is available for anybody to look up to allow you to know where things came from and where they've been and where you are in this blockchain. And based on this, obviously, you could use it for sustainability. You could use it for some of the claims you're making that may be beyond the point of food safety. Now, who is getting behind this? Obviously, companies like IBM. And who just sent out a letter just recently? Walmart did. And Walmart sent out a letter just recently, I think it was September, saying that if you are going to be a supplier to Walmart, then you better get into blockchain. And I would imagine the consequences are going to be, if you don't, then maybe Walmart's not going to buy from you anymore. And remember, Walmart was those who sent out the letter in 2008 saying if you didn't become GFSI approved, then they weren't going to buy from you. And then after Walmart did that, then everybody else jumped in. And so most of your customers also then said you should go GFSI. I'm not saying they're all going to say you should go blockchain. What they're going to be saying to you is, you should be able to know where your stuff came from. You should know to where your stuff is going to, and there should be some type of a mechanism by which somebody can look back and be able to trace everything all the way back to where it was grown, where the animal was raised, where the things came from orchards. And in other words, we can do this rapidly. We can do it when we need to, and we can make sure there are no problems getting the product out of the marketplace. Because you say, well, why do I need to know all that stuff? If things are going fine, maybe you don't need to know all that stuff. But the thing is, things don't always go all fine. And then when you have to have a problem and you have to get your product back out of the marketplace, how quickly can you do it? So basically, how will you respond? How are you going to be able to handle these challenges that are there today? And a lot of medium and small companies don't necessarily have all of the technical expertise and have to reach out to get help on these things. Do you know where to go to get this help? Are you sure you're where you need to be to keep the regulators from being concerned about you? Where you can have consumer confidence in what you do, that you can make sure that you're not going to be involved in a recall. Let's go back to recalls and talk a little bit more about that. The FDA has said here in the United States, under the preventive controls for human foods, or the preventive controls for pet food, preventive controls for animal feed, that they're going to hold you responsible for a contaminated ingredient, even though you didn't cause it. Well, in the past, you sometimes could have deflected that to your supplier and say, well, they caused it, therefore they're the problem. But remember, your customer didn't buy the product from your ingredient supplier. Therefore, you let your customer down. So now you got regulators saying you can't let your customers down and then deflect the problem to other people. And you're going to have to do that by controlling your supply chain. So now if your supplier has a food fraud problem, or has a food defense problem, or has a food safety problem, it now comes to your doorstep. Because you allowed them to have food safety problems because you didn't find out that they didn't. You allowed them to have food fraud problems and you didn't check to see how their food fraud programs were. You didn't make sure that they got good food defense. And you say, wow, I've I've got to make sure all my suppliers are where they need to be, because if they don't have all these things and it causes me a problem, I'm going to be held accountable. Yes, you are. And remember, here in America, being such a litigious society, it's not only the regulators you have to worry about, it's the lawyers who come in and sue you. And sometimes that's a bigger problem than the regulators. So when we're talking about these challenges, don't just think about I have to do them for GFSI. Don't just think about I have to do them because the regulators say them. Don't think about it because my customer demands them of me. Think about them. This may be the difference between I am in business today and I'm out of business tomorrow. And that's why we've given you some examples of companies who haven't controlled it, or they haven't controlled the aftermath and their public image. And they finish up either their share value is half of it is today, or they finish up they've lost a lot of customers and they're trying to get them back, or the worst case scenario, they've gone out of business. And so therefore, when you talk about this, you say, well, where can I go get help? Well, we're here to give you help. So I just want to let you know that if this is a business that we can help you with. But there are other resources, and some of it's free. And so we put up a couple of things here. Remember, you will get a copy of all these slides after this presentation. And therefore, the FDA is trying to help you. They have been very proactive in trying to put out guidance documents, put out information, try to give you websites to go to, and they're even better in answering questions these days. Was initially when they came out with the Food Safety Modernization Act, the questions overwhelmed the system, and you could be waiting 6 months to get an answer. I think that's down to now just a couple of weeks, and you'll generally get an answer from the FDA, CFIA, USDA, or whoever your government is. The FDA is going to give us more direction on food fraud. So you're right, food fraud is something that's difficult right now to understand. Where would that apply to me? How am I going to put a program into effect? And now I've got GFSI auditors coming in saying you got to have a program, but I'm not quite sure what program I need or what to put in it. And the FDA hasn't been very definitive yet, but they've said it's coming. So what's that mean? Next year, 2019, I would think so. But can you wait till the FDA tells you what to do? I think you're vulnerable right now. We've got a company called SSAFE, and they basically have, again, a free food fraud assessment tool, which, again, you can go to, and we're not pushing them. This is just another resource that we're giving you information on. And they actually have a questionnaire. And that questionnaire has about 50 questions in it that you can take and send to your suppliers and see what type of answers you get. You may go, I don't need to send them 50 questions. So you can take that list and you can make it 20 questions. But what you got to do is you got to make sure your suppliers have food fraud programs, because they don't have one. Then they could send you a fraudulent ingredient. It may not be 100% fraudulent. It may only be 10%. And then you go ahead and use it. And then you have a problem because you've now got a fraudulent ingredient in your product, which causes you to have a recall. If it's not a food safety issue, it may still make you have to call it back because it's fraudulent. But if it causes a food safety issue, that's going to be a big concern. Michigan State University has a website, and you can go there and get information on that. And I sat through one done by them, a webinar done by them just a short while ago, which was pretty informative. Use your resources. Go on the internet. It's amazing what you can find out on the internet, and most of it's credible. Some of it's not, but most of it's credible. But you've got to be in control to bring things to your knowledge. And one, I can't afford to have a problem tomorrow. Two, I got to make sure that I don't have a regulatory problem tomorrow. I certainly don't want to have a recall tomorrow. And I certainly don't want to have my consumer or customer leave me tomorrow because I had a problem. And then the question is, if you have a problem, how can you minimize it? And who is responsible in your company? And that's why we talk about you having a recall team, and do you practice recalls? And do you have the people on the team who can get the recall to happen? And again, we had a cereal not long ago, a popular cereal with kids that was out in the marketplace with a problem. And it was still out in the marketplace a couple of months later. And so the system wasn't working too well when you've got a problematic product out there and it's not being pulled out of the retail stores. That's embarrassing. That's a disaster. And it's certainly a problem to the consumer, who in this case may be a child eating that type of product. So what we wanted to do is make sure that we brought these to you. And then I'm going to ask Holly what type of questions that this has raised that we can answer for you. So what type of questions do we have, Holly?
That's great.
Here says, can food fraud and food defense be interchangeable? The answer is no. They are two different things. Food fraud is totally different than food defense. And that's where some of the people have had problems when the GFSI auditors come in, and the audit that they had last year didn't ask for food fraud like SQF didn't. And this year it asked for food fraud, and they put in front of the auditor their food defense program, and they expected the auditor to be happy with that. No, there are two separate things. They're not interchangeable. And people lost up to 10 points on their GFSI audit, in this case, their SQF audit, because they didn't have a food fraud program. So what else do you say? How do we get our suppliers to improve income and product food fraud? Well, first of all, you ask them if they have a food fraud program. You ask them to share details with you about their food fraud program. You ask them to be able to show how risky they think some of their ingredients are. Now understand that not everything is prone to food fraud. Because when you look at something and it looks like an apple, it looks like a banana, it looks like a piece of beef, the chances are it is. But what about those ingredients that are white powders or something where they could be what they're supposed to be, but they could not? Those are the ones that the regulators and you need to be concerned about. Could I substitute something in there? We've heard about Parmesan cheese having some shavings of wood in there because it looks like grated Parmesan cheese. And when you throw it onto your spaghetti or you throw it onto your pizza and you eat it, does it really taste like shaved wood? No. But I managed to get more money for it because I was able to put 5% in there. So it's not that food fraud is going to be with everything you buy, but the question is, what are you buying and what is your supplier doing to make sure that they don't have food fraud problems? So that's it.
Dr. Bob, sorry, one other question here. Just going back to the food fraud versus food crime, can you just highlight the difference between those?
Food fraud? Food fraud is somebody taking an ingredient and adding to it something that isn't what it is for economic gain. Now you say, well, what's the difference between food defense? The people who are doing food defense are trying to make the food harmful to the consumer. They're trying to get their moment in a press. They're not necessarily wanting to be named, but they want to go, like, for instance, let's talk about somebody putting the needles in the strawberries. I don't think they wanted to do that and not have somehow headlines. I'm sure they got a lot of satisfaction out of the headlines. I'm sure they didn't want to get caught. Why they did it, we have no idea, but the intent was to provide some injury or illness to the consumer. The food fraud people, I don't think are thinking that way. I think they're thinking about, what can I add to this so I can make money? Can I add to extra virgin olive oil, vegetable oil at 10%? And therefore it's an economic gain and it's not going to cause anybody a health problem. I'm not sure they're even thinking about whether it'll cause people a health problem or not. And that's why I'm sure the people who ground up the peanut shells maybe didn't say, oh, got to worry about people with peanut allergens. But the people who are doing food defense and therefore doing food adulteration deliberately, I think in most cases they're making a statement and they want it to affect the consumer, or they certainly want it to affect your company and cause you to lose business. And that's why if you read the food defense regulations, it can be an inside customer, it can be a competitor who's doing it. It's somebody who's trying to do harm to you as a company, and they're doing it by contaminating a product where they know it will cause you some distress.
So that's great, thank you. Can we go back to the question about vulnerability assessment? We've got lots of questions on how folks address there's quite a few questions, so I'll collate this here. We address food defense as part of our food safety management system under the vulnerability assessment. So the earlier question, just going back to that, can you elaborate on a vulnerability assessment done under food defense and what that means?
Is you have to take your whole operation and you put it under like a magnifying glass, and you say to yourself, if I was a person who wanted to contaminate the product on purpose, whether there's somebody inside your company or somebody outside your company, where could they get to an ingredient and add something to it? Where could they do it inside my plant? Where could they do it on the truck coming to me? Where could they do it at my supplier? And the person who's going to do it is generally going to try to do it when nobody notices that they're doing it, because obviously it's not going to be very effective if they do it and somebody catches it straight away. So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to make sure that I can do it and you don't catch me. And so therefore I'm likely to do it at a point in your operation where I can approach it and I can put it in there and not have a problem. So vulnerability assessment is, where have you got open kettles? Where have you got exposed product? Where can I add something that may not be noticeable to a fellow worker? Where do you have people working in an ingredient room who measure stuff out, and the only person in that room is them? And have you got a camera in there? Do you have a second person in there? Because that's when I'm likely to do it. And then that bag of premix goes out on the floor, and is the operator going to know that it's got something in there that shouldn't be there? No. They're going to throw it in the mix, you're going to make the product, and then it's going to go on. So therefore, a vulnerability assessment is going to see. That's why we started locking trucks. You say, well, why do we lock trucks coming down the highway? Because the regulators, the intelligence community was convinced that maybe people were going to climb in the back of trucks and contaminate the product in the truck. Prior to 9/11, we thought that the biggest problem in those trucks was people were going to steal the stuff on the truck. So they were going to steal your case of beer, or they're going to steal your steaks. And that certainly was a concern, but at least they stole it. They didn't contaminate. The problem today is, can they get into a tanker? Can they get into a silo? Can they get into something and contaminate it? And have you done a vulnerability assessment of how likely that is? Because if you're vulnerable to it, somebody sometime is going to do it. And you say, no, they're not. We've got a lot of nice employees working in our company, and I hope you do. But the day they do it and you don't catch it till it goes out, and now people are getting sick or people are dying, then one thing you're into is litigation. 2, you're into the FDA saying you shouldn't have avoided that. And 3, you're going to finish up having to do a massive recall.
So going back up to that, when you identify the failure for food fraud, how do you look at getting the solution to address the vulnerability?
Well, that's a good question, and that's why we're still waiting to see if the FDA can give us some help on that, because one, knowing what food fraud is one of our challenges. What's more vulnerable to food fraud is another challenge. And then secondly, what am I going to do to make sure I'm not having food fraud even when I put a food fraud program into effect? You're right, this is not as well documented as food defense and food safety and food quality and all the other things we've been doing for years. And so we all are, auditors, consultants, and everybody, still wrestling with what can we do to avoid it, and how would we know it if it was there?
How do you do a mock food fraud exercise?
How do you do a mock food fraud exercise? That's an interesting question as well, because it's part of what the FDA is going to require that you do. I suppose what you do is you take an ingredient that it could be a subject of food fraud and you analyze it. So if you think, like, for instance, let's pick honey, and I don't want to pick on the honey industry, but let's pick honey because that's certainly been one of the industries that suffered from food fraud over the years. And I say, and I want to make sure this is 100% honey. And I want to make sure nobody's added any corn syrups or anything else to it, maybe added color to it and made it look like honey. Well, if I really think that honey is fraudulent, and maybe my source of supply is fraudulent, then what I would want to do is send it off to a lab to analyze it. And there are some sophisticated labs now who can do some sophisticated testing on honey to tell you it's 100% honey. They can even tell you what type of bees. They can even tell you what country it comes from, because sometimes the fraud isn't that it isn't honey, but it's coming from China, and Chinese honey is not legally allowed into the United States. And so therefore it's fraudulent if you bring in that stuff in and advertising it as honey. It's not that it isn't honey, it's just that it's not legal. So that would be where I would say you would do it. That means some companies are going to say, we're not prone to food fraud because we basically look at all our ingredients, and if anything was fraudulent about them, we could see it, we could smell it, we could taste it. There'll be something that would change the characteristics of it. And that's why I said to you, not everything gets subjected to being impossible to do food fraud on.
How do we get our suppliers to prove incoming product? So avoid food fraud.
The same thing, you're going to ask them to challenge. You're going to challenge them. Now, sometimes you're going to say, well, is my customer going to share with me my food fraud program? The answer is maybe they will, maybe they're not. And if they're not, you may need to do one or two things. Go visit them yourself, and they will share it you while you're at their facility, but they're not going to share it you by attaching it to an email. Or you say, well, if you're not going to be open with us, we're going to have to buy the ingredients somewhere else. There are certain countries in the world, not wanting to name them, where you're going to be a lot more cautious about food fraud than some other countries, simply because they have a history of being involved in food fraud in the past. And the FDA is helping you a little on some of that, because they've said on food safety that they believe Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have equal systems to the USA. And so therefore they're saying you need to demand less of those suppliers in those countries. Well, that's not only food defense, that's food fraud, that's food safety, etc. But if you're buying from some of those other countries that the regulators are having problems giving them a high rating, and this is USDA, FDA, or anything, then I would be a little bit more cautious when I'm buying something from them, particularly if they've been named in some food fraud problems in the past.
Thanks for that. Going back to the vulnerability assessment. So the other question from one of our attendees that indicated the vulnerability assessment is completed under the food fraud program, but for the purpose of compliance, does that need to be done for food defense program as well? So does a vulnerability assessment need to be done for food defense programs as well?
Oh, yes. Yeah, for food defense, you're certainly going to do it. And that's why we talked about the fact that the FDA, when they put into effect next year their requirements for food defense, it requires a thorough, written vulnerability assessment, not just a casual one, not just a superficial one, but a detailed one. And then you have to hope the FDA agrees with your vulnerability assessment, but clearly if they come in and you don't even have one, then that's going to be your first challenge.
Okay. Can you explain the difference between traceability and blockchain?
Traceability and blockchain are both related. The fact is that blockchain is hopefully going to give you the traceability that you would have to do by other means. Because right now your traceability mostly involves the fact that you have a bill of lading coming in with an ingredient. And on that bill of lading, hopefully is the quantity, hopefully is a lot number, and therefore you start your traceability right there. Well, unfortunately, that's a little too far along the chain, because you want to know something about the history of that ingredient coming from your supplier, and where did your supplier get it from? Was that from a grower? And therefore blockchain is going to enable you and your supplier to go back one step back, all the way back to the farmer. When you add your information in and then you sell that ingredient to another further processor, they'll be able to go back and look all the way through the chain. And in the end, when it finishes up at retail, the retailer will be able to do that. And what we're finding out now is the regulators are now starting to demand more of food service chefs and starting to demand more of food retailers, that they're going to have to start keeping some records, which are going to be a nightmare for them, but blockchain may very well make it easier for them because it will already be there. So that's the difference between what you're doing now on traceability and what hopefully in the future you'll be able to do. You'll know what everybody else has done, not just what you're doing.
Okay. How do you see food fraud as it relates to supplying packaging to the food industry?
Well, food packaging is a little different, and what is really surprising somewhat is that the FDA, under the Food Safety Modernization Act and the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, decided that foreign suppliers were going to have to meet a different standard than domestic suppliers, and therefore they were going to have to meet the Food Safety Modernization Act if you were a foreign packaging supplier. And why do you think that is? Well, I suspect that the FDA feels that there may be some out there packaging coming from countries outside of the US that are more prone to not be what they claim. And we're seeing problems now with bisphenol A, which of course has had some problems with kids and was taken out of plastic feeding bottles for kids years ago. We're now finding out maybe it has bigger problems than that. We're finding out that there is some migration from some packaging materials that we didn't think was there before. We're finding out that sometimes somebody wants to sell you a packaging material that's not approved for food contact. I wouldn't put that at the same level as the hazards and challenges that come with food ingredients, but I would say that the packaging industry is prone at times to have a few problems, but people in the end don't eat the packaging. But the question is, what's migrating? And in the case of bisphenol A, bisphenol A, it was actually getting in there and getting into the babies, and it was causing them to react as if they were having some type of a hormone type thing added to their body. And so therefore, the FDA started to do that. Now we're seeing the world is now starting to react to that as well. And so therefore, we're having some issues with packaging that we wouldn't have talked about 10, 15 years ago.
Okay. So when we talk about a vulnerability assessment, could historical data, relationships with suppliers be elements of that assessment?
Yes. Yes, certainly. If you're having a relationship with a supplier and they haven't been involved in any food fraud, food defense, or any incident, certainly this is how you find your trusted suppliers. But keep up to date on that stuff. Make sure you're reading the warning letters from the FDA. Make sure that you're looking at recalls. Make sure that you're looking to see who's having a recall. Make sure that isn't one of your suppliers. And if you can know where they're buying from, and again, this gets into sometimes the willingness of your supplier to tell you where they're buying their ingredients that go into what you're buying from them, then you can maybe trace that. So who's doing that for you? Who's managing your risk? Who's looking at the bigger picture so that you don't miss seeing something that you say, aha, that would cause me to reevaluate this supplier, even though we didn't buy that ingredient. They've just had a recall on another ingredient. So if they've got a recall on that ingredient, does this identify they have some food safety challenges at their plant that may affect an ingredient I've been buying from them? Maybe it doesn't, but it would make you look at them a little closer.
Okay. Many of the food fraud program requirements emphasize the finding of the risk, but no real mitigation strategy. Do you have any real mitigation strategies that can be applied to prevent food fraud?
I wish I did. I wish I could give you an answer to all those food fraud questions. And I said I thought food fraud was going to be your biggest challenge. And I think you indicated that when you answered that poll that we did earlier. It is an area that's new. It is an area of new concern. It is an area that we're all wrestling with. What does it mean? And unfortunately, we're going to have to go back to some examples of food fraud, and hopefully we're not going to have a whole lot more food fraud examples, because you learn from other people's mistakes. You learn from what is happening. And one of the things that we do have ability now is we can see things in a global basis, which may be not affecting us here in North America now, but could tomorrow if we're not aware of food fraud problems happening in the rest of the world. Wish I had answers for you on that question, but I don't. Hopefully I'll be more knowledgeable 6 months from now, a year from now, and so will you.
Care to take a comment on the technology you believe that produce suppliers will deploy to comply with Walmart's new blockchain mandate?
Well, actually, Walmart did mention leafy greens as the fact that that's their success story right now. They say they can trace leafy greens that go into the Walmart stores all the way back to the field. And if you think about it, when we had that problem this last spring, which was romaine lettuce, and we had the problem where we couldn't find the source of the contamination, they subsequently found it now in a canal there. And we weren't quite sure, other than at that time of the year, all of the romaine lettuce is coming out of Yuma, Arizona versus coming out of Salinas, California. It would have been much better if we'd had a lot more history, because it basically almost destroyed the romaine lettuce business in America. and nobody was eating romaine lettuce, and nobody was doing Caesar salad. And that's the type of thing we want to try to minimize the impact when we have problems. Otherwise, it devastates everything. We had an incident many years ago with strawberries, and we had another incident many years ago with tomatoes. And basically, those problems were so big that people stopped eating tomatoes. They stopped eating strawberries. We didn't know where the tomatoes were coming from, whether they were coming from outside of the United States or they were coming from different states. And nobody cared other than they all stopped eating tomatoes. And we devastated the whole industry because we couldn't get on top of the problem quickly. And so I think it's the same thing here. We got to come up with mechanisms to minimize the problem across all areas, and that means across the globe.
Okay. Last question here. How do we satisfy multiple regulations, US, Canada, and abroad, with regards to our suppliers? We are certified to a GFSI recognized standard.
Well, that's the challenge of being in the global world. The thing about it is, obviously, you could minimize where you're buying from, and that has its consequences on price and availability, because you don't want to minimize where you can buy, but you need to minimize if it's a food safety, food fraud, or food defense issue. And the same with you when you're buying multiple ingredients from multiple countries. We've already got the FDA approving 3 countries right now and saying they're on the verge of approving other countries. Doesn't mean I'm telling you you should buy just from those countries, but I'm telling you that you've got a little bit more reassurance if you buy from those countries than if you do for others. Doesn't mean that the government, the FDA, is right all the time, but what they're saying is they've looked at their food safety systems, they've looked at their food defense systems, and felt that those 3 countries are doing as good as, if not better than, what we're doing in the United States. You have to look at that and say, well, I'm in Canada, or I'm in England, or I'm in Mexico. Who do you trust? What's the basis of that trust? And where do you really want to go out on a limb? And that's why I use the thing when I'm teaching a lot of my classes. Maybe we'll end on this. Buying on price is not what you do these days. And that may be a shock to your buyers. And that may be a de-incentive to your buyers, who sometimes are based on how much money can you save the company, and they may be recognized in their annual reviews or bonus plan. You got to buy on food safety, and that includes food defense, and that includes food fraud. And after that, then buy on price. But if you're going to use price as your criteria, you're basically looking for a fall, unfortunately, because somebody will try to sell you something at a better price, but is it safe? Is it going to bring you problems? And the problems, as you saw it on recalls, 3 million to 100 million if you make the wrong decision on what you're buying.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bob, for your presentation. And we're at the top of the hour, so I'll close it off. For anyone who submitted a question that we did not answer, rest assured we'll address one-to-one outside of the webinar. So with that, we'll close off. I'll remind everyone we have recorded it. We'll share a link to the recording as well as the slide deck within 2 business days. And thank you very much for your attendance, and Dr. Bob, for your presentation today.